Hello, Dr. Stephanie. Welcome to Emotionally Uncomfortable.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm very excited to have this conversation with you for many reasons. I've been following you for a while, and you just, I would say, represent I don't even like the term middle-aged, but when people are entering
Well
par
lived.
well-lived, is that what
Well
you
lived.
said?
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
like that well-lived.
Yeah.
Um, and before we hit record, we talked about this, but perimenopause, menopause, hormones, all the things. There's in my community, people are they're not getting older, they're just growing with me and new challenges, new level, new devil. And sometimes we're experiencing changes in our body, we're experiencing changes in our mind, and we're seeing it on the outside in relationships, in passion, in energy. And then what we do is we start seeking support and getting back these disempowered answers. And so I love to bring women on like you who have a different definition of a well lived life. So, welcome. And before we dive into like your story, like how do you define, I hate the term midlife. So, I know you just said well lived, but what do you say midlife?
I don't really use midlife. I typically will say a woman in her 40s or a woman in her 50s
Hmm.
or, whatever. I don't necessarily use the term midlife, although technically I guess that is true. If we look at lifespan for females, it's around 80-ish, 78, 79. So sure,
Yep.
40s, middle of that. Um, but I think
Transitioning.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the sort of typical stereotypes around women who are in perimenopause or who are in midlife and menopause is that your life is over. But really,
Mm,
when you sort of look at the lifespan of females, we tend to live longer than men, at least on average by about 5 or 6 years. And
mhm.
so when you go through menopause, which is about, for most women, like the statistical average is about 51 years of age, you still have a good 40%. If you are just the average, if you are just living to 78 or 79, when whatever the number is, you still have 40% of your life left. That is a big chunk of time.
Mhm.
And so I really like to think about midlife and beyond, if you will, or well lived, having a well lived life,
Yeah.
is maybe you're no longer reproductive, right? So have no longer have those reproductive faculties anymore, but you can be incredibly productive, right? You can be an incredibly productive member of your family, of your community, and it really is an opportunity for you to get back to who you already are, right? But,
Mhm.
a lot of women who are listening maybe are mothers who have been in service to their children. And, ain't no hood like motherhood, right? So, like, motherhood has all of its
Yeah.
challenges with
Yep.
it. But, when you get to 40s and 50s, a lot of your, your children may be there. I mean, I shouldn't really say this for everyone. I have a girlfriend who is 43 now, and she just had her first baby. But for many women who've had their children, let's say late 20s, 30s, they're kind of at least tweens-ish. So you
Hmm.
don't need to change the diaper so often anymore. And you can really start coming back to who you are, who you
Hmm.
always have been, but
Hmm.
maybe have put yourself aside. So it's a time for reevaluation. I like to call it a second spring
Hmm.
as well. It's another time for opportunity and to plant seeds and watch them grow.
Yeah. I feel like I came out of the womb like a million years old. Like I was considered like an old soul,
Yeah.
like even as a child, and
Yeah.
then had to grow up very, very quickly. Um, and I experienced medical induced menopause, which no one told me I was going to go into menopause. So that was
Was that
terrifying
post
and traumatic.
chemo?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I didn't know that. And so I didn't know what menopause was. And then I hear these conversations and stories from older women now, like, you just wait. And there's this dread and
Mm.
this scary, like, haunting thing of like, what's going to happen to me? And so I am determined to be like, no, 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 no. Life does not need to suck. Menopause does not need to suck. And it's people like you that change this conversation. So can you just dive in a little bit, maybe when we're not in a crisis state, but maybe like starting to notice those shifts? What is perimenopause and how can we identify if we're starting to experience any form of those symptoms and not just within our cycle, but maybe in our brain as well?
Sure. Yeah. And I actually just want to come back to what you said there for a moment, because I think in years past, our foremothers, mothers, aunts, grandmothers, it really did suck for them. Because they were often suffering in silence. They weren't given tools and treatment remedies. They were told, well, it's just suck it up, buttercup. Like this is what it
Yeah.
is, it's aging. So I think for that fear around it is going to suck holds water insofar as it really did for some women, because
Mhm.
they would ask for help, as you mentioned, and would be dismissed most often by sort of that traditional medical establishment, because there really wasn't a lot of options. I mean, we won't get into the Women's Health Initiative, which I think really put women's healthcare back, easily 20 years. And it's about 20 years now since that paper came out. So we're starting to maybe move past it. But I think for, just acknowledging that for, our elders, who are the ones who often pass on some of the wisdom to us, right? It really was difficult for them.
Mhm.
For us now, I said to you before we started recording, I think sort of perimenopause and menopause certainly is sort of having a moment where women are like, actually, I'm not gonna, like, I don't have to suffer when there are options available to me.
Mhm.
So when we just define perimenopause, it is a bit of a vague definition, but it is the 5 to 10-ish years leading up to menopause. So menopause, as I mentioned, statistical average for most women is about 51. So somewhere in your 40s, I've seen women, mid 30s, starting to experience sort of signs and clinical symptoms of perimenopause. So what that might look like, the two big ones are body composition changes, like, hey, doc, I'm doing the exact same workout, I'm having the exact same calories, like living my same life, as
Mhm.
a 43-year-old, as I was when I was 33 and 23, and I'm gaining weight and I don't know why. So and women are particularly sensitive to that for a variety of reasons, but body composition changes. So seeing fat distributed usually through the midsection, like through the tummy area, where it really wasn't an issue before. And then the other big one is sleep. So you might have been, good sleeper, average sleeper beforehand, but then you sort of turn 43 and you can't, like, falling asleep is a problem,
You're like,
staying
wha-bam.
asleep. Yeah. And like, wha-bam, exactly. So, those witching hours between 2 and 4 in the morning, like you're waking up,
Mhm.
maybe you've overheated, maybe you're sweating, or you just have an incredibly difficult time getting back to sleep. So those are sort of the two big ones that I hear. More subtle changes are changes in mood and affect. So we were saying this before we started recording, but things that used to really bring someone joy, hobbies or activities or connecting with others, these just become more laborious. You don't find as much joy, anticipating events coming up. Maybe there's weddings or baptisms or, whatever it is.
Mhm.
So things like that start to change. You can become more sensitive to sound. Before I used to be the girl with like the music blasting all the time. And then if my kids are listening to something that's too loud, I'm like, ugh, So, like sound sensitivity, light sensitivity, some of the senses, like we just become a little bit more recluse. Those are some of the general signs and symptoms of perimenopause, but most women are going to notice body comp changes and sleep. Those are like the two big ones.
What about relationships? I'm just curious if you notice any like trends because
Yeah.
I'll see someone, they come in, they're like, okay, there's a relationship disconnect. I'm trying to learn these new skills. I talk a lot about emotional intelligence or, what's your
Mhm.
soul craving? What do you want your life to look like? And it's like they turn 40 and they're like, I need to make this decision. What have I been doing with my life? Like that what is your perception on the midlife? I call it a midlife adventure, but like the midlife crisis that they talked
Mhm.
about formally. Does that have anything to do with body shifts?
I think it can. I think it certainly can. I think that you sort of in your 40s, at least I've noticed this for myself, you start to think about your own mortality more. I never really thought about dying or the end of my life in my 20s and my 30s, even when I was raising kids. Like that never crossed my mind. And now in my 40s, it's like, oh, I'm about halfway through. Right. So I think that there's some, and I think that there's a uh, persevering fear around death generally, which I'm sure, you can speak to more than anyone, sort of
Hmm.
having faced death really, approaching death's door. And I think we start to think about our mortality more. So there's almost a constraint of time. Like, hey, I have, got like 40 more, let's say,
Hmm.
at best, hopefully without disease, the way that, I've spent hopefully the first 40 years.
Yeah.
So you start to think about, what is it that I really want out of this life? What kind of person do I want to be? What kind of what sort of change do I want to see in the world? So I think that some of those deeper philosophical questions start
Mhm.
to come up at a higher frequency in your 40s than maybe they have in years past.
Yeah. Yeah, I see that a lot too. And it's like begin to raise your standards. If you choose that, you're either going to become angry and resentful and bitter, or you're looking at it and you're like, how can I? How can I? Right? You can
Right.
see the fork is starting to kind of like, what do you call that? The fork in the road. You're like, okay, you're either going to become more bitter or you're going to become lighter. And you have
Yeah.
to like consciously choose that.
Yeah.
So, okay, these things are happening to you. Now you start taking action. You start going to your doctor, and everything is coming back normal, and you do not feel normal. So, what do you say to that woman that's like, I listen to the podcast, I read the books, I have a holistic functional approach, and yet where do I go? I feel lost on this journey, and now I'm more fatigued and overwhelmed than ever before, and I'm starting to lose hope. So you're giving us hope. You're like, this does not need to be your way of being in the world, but eating, working out, now do I have gut issues? Is it my hormones? What is it? This is a lot of time and energy investment. So what do you say to simplify this for people?
Sure. Yeah. And I would say, whenever we are trying to make evidence-based decisions, there's sort of a Venn diagram, right, that we want to think about. One is like your lab tests, right? So lab tests coming back as normal uh, is not the whole picture. So your lab test can come back normal. That's sort of one of three things that we want to think about. The other thing is clinical symptoms. So if the patient is, or if the individual is saying, hey, I don't feel the way I used to. I'm fatigued all the time, or the things that I used to do that bring me a lot of joy and pleasure no longer are happening for me. That's another thing that needs to be taken into consideration. I would also say, back to the labs. One of the things that we've seen, at least over the last several decades, is that the values of normal have shifted significantly. So we see this with sex hormones. We see this with we see this with thyroid. We see this across the bar, where if you were to take the same, if we could time travel and go back to the 1970s or the 1980s, and look at a lab report at that point, what would be considered normal? So when the lab gives you a spit out of your results and how that compares to what normal is much different than it is today. And in fact, there's an average, like usually 2 to 3 standard deviations lower. So your labs so if you're watching this, or you're listening to this, I'm using air quotes. So they may come back normal, but it might not be normal for you, right? So it still might be out of the range. So there's that. So I just wanted to kind of pin that off to the side. But we also, even if they come back normal, and even if they come back normal for a woman in her who's at 1981, right? If your clinical symptoms, if you're saying, I'm not feeling like myself, I know my labs are normal, but I'm not myself. One of the things that medicine, honestly, unfortunately, has done a terrible job at is listening to women. So, we label women hysterical, which, I mean, I don't know if any of you are word nerds that are listening, but the word hysterical comes from the word uterus. So it's the Greek word for uterus, and hysterical literally means wandering uterus. So when we call something hysterical, it's
Oh, wow.
rather derogatory. So it used to be thought that, her uterus is, driving her, temporary psychosis, right? So I actually dislike that word, but we call women hysterical. We call them difficult. We call them complainers, whiners, et cetera, et cetera. So the other thing I think that we can do a much better job at in healthcare in general is listening to women and believing them when they say that they're not normal. It's like heal thyself, doctor. She's going to know more about her own internal state than we ever could, even with all our algorithms and all the tests and all the things. So there's the clinical piece, and then of course there's the clinician's knowledge, right? So we also have to put that into. So a clinician might not necessarily be trained in. I see this all the time with thyroid and we see it with hormones, which I know we're going to talk about today. But women will get their thyroid labs back, they're normal. And then the woman will say, but I listened to Dr. Stephanie on so and so's podcast, and you didn't run this lab. And it's not going to change the way that the medical doctor is not trained in it. And it's not going to change the way that they care for you because they are also directed by the standards of care in the licensing state or province that they are practicing in. So it doesn't matter if you have antibodies, right? It doesn't matter if you come back with, they're still going to give you Synthroid. Like it's not going to change their prescribing behavior. So you also have to take into account the philosophical premise and the philosophy of the doctor that's sitting across from you,
Mm.
right? Have they taken functional medicine courses? Have they taken, continuing education in women's health? That might be some questions that you might want to consider when your doctor is saying, you're fine, you're
Yeah.
normal. There's nothing wrong with
I actually never considered the last one.
you.
Um, their philosophy and in their like view of the subscription, like what the protocol or the subscription that they're going to give you,
Yeah,
because we're so conditioned to be like, did you do this test? What about this? What about this? What about this? And
yeah.
not the person who's like taking all of that information
What's
and
their
then
worldview on it? Yeah.
yes,
Hmm.
yes, that's very, very, very important because people can become obsessed with testing over, they're like, I know I'm out of alignment, something's off, I need this test, I need this test. But you can't really change the worldview of someone sitting across from you. And that is incredibly important. I mean, you can, but not in one conversation. If you want to,
Right.
if you're looking for alignment, it's probably better to look at the person rather than the actual testing.
Yeah, and for me, I'd be like they don't have to agree with everything that I'm bringing to the table, but they have to have the cognitive flexibility to be able to see where I'm coming from, and to know what to do with it. So those are some of the things that I think about when when I myself receive medical care. It's like what's the relationship that I can have with this doctor? What's the type of discourse that I can have with them? Are they tolerant to me disagreeing with their recommendations or having a conversation about it?
Yeah.
And that drives I advise that to people who are, that I'm not able to care for in person. And then it drives my own behavior as well. It's like, what's the person's worldview sitting across from me?
Okay. So I'm just thinking of someone listening to this and they're like, yes, yes, yes. Okay. What do you suggest? So I'm just playing a little devil's advocate. What do you suggest to that person that's like, I'm fatigued now? I have like fatigue from, I guess it would be health fatigue. I actually
It's
just
like there's too
talked
much
to,
information.
well, not even that. They're doing the things and
Okay.
they're doing all the things. Like I actually had a client reach out to me yesterday because I don't talk about, obviously, I'm not qualified to talk about health in that perspective at all. And I'm like, what have you tried? And she's listing off all the things that she's tried, right?
Right.
So
Right.
where do you tell that person to go or what to do when they're getting that? They're in that fatigue state of like, I'm now taking this functional approach. I've shifted from here to here. What else am I missing? Because I still do not feel like myself.
Yeah, I would say that for at least I can say in my experience of having, being in private practice for the decades that I have been and private clients that I've consulted with, um, a lot of it is getting back to basics. And I know that it's like the boring stuff that everyone wants, like what's the sexy new
I
glute
so love that you're
exercise?
saying this right now.
Okay, so this
I
is
love
this
it.
is sorry, yeah, you wanted to say something?
No, I just love it because I appreciate it. It's like it's not marketable, but it's falling in
It's
love with
not
the boring.
It's the surrender to the monotony of the same things over a long period of time. I mean, the people that you see on Instagram with the perfect glutes, and I mean, first of all, photo editing and all that stuff may be coming into play, but let's just assume for a moment that it's not. They're doing squats several times a week. They're doing deadlifts several times a week. They're not doing like the fun, cool, here's the crazy thing that you can do on the Smith machine. Like that's not what built their glutes, right? So, I mean, that's just one kind of example, but a lot of times when we're trying to work with women, it's like getting back to how much time do you spend outside? Do you spend time outside in the morning? What time do you put your phone down at night? Are you doom scrolling on the couch for hours on end? And the algorithm is like learning what creates a fear response or what content you interact with more. So it feeds you more stuff about Israel and it feeds you more stuff about the Ukraine. It feeds you more stuff about people dying and or whatever. So how much, that stuff is like low to no cost. Like everybody has access to the sun. We just have to walk outside. Yeah. So some of these things are low to no cost, right? So when was the last time that you got out and had some sunshine? You can put your phone, everybody can put their phone away 1 to 2 hours before bedtime. Like these are easy things to do,
Mhm.
but sometimes we dismiss them because they are so easy, but they do measurably make an impact on our sleep, on our mental health and well-being, on our anxiety levels, on our happiness, our enjoyment in life. And then the other things I would say is what kind of movement are we doing consistently? So certainly, I'm a big proponent of resistance training and lifting heavy things, but maybe that's not, save for a gym membership, that's really the only barrier of entry there. But even in the maybe there's a reality where a gym membership is not possible. Everybody has a pair of trainers. If you're listening to this podcast, you have a pair of shoes, you can get out and walk. And it's actually, I think the way that North Americans view exercise is part of the problem. Right? So you and I are both Canadians,
Mhm.
and living in North American culture. A lot of what we think exercise is getting in a car, going to the gym, working out for 45 to 60 minutes, and then coming home and sitting at our office for the next 12, right?
I was saying next 12 hours.
Yeah,
Yeah.
next 12 to 14, on a bad day. We're sitting a lot of the time. So that's not what exercise is. Exercise is constant little, I like to call them movement snacks. So instead of going up to the fridge for a little snack, you go out for a little movement snack. So I work primarily from home. So I'll get up and do a lap around the block or something like that, or I'll go and put in a load of laundry or, whatever. So these little movement snacks that we actually see Europeans adopt very well. I mean, there's other comments that you can make about European cities. They're much more pedestrian friendly. They were built a long time ago before the advent of cars. So it's a lot easier to get around. But a lot of these European, even in the bigger cities where there is a lot of volume and there's a lot of traffic, people will walk a lot of the day. So they will go for lunch and then they will walk afterwards. And then they'll go and walk to the patisserie or the bakery, and they'll get their bread and then they walk home. And then they'll go meet a friend for coffee and then they'll walk home. And then they go walk in the evening with the family. So there's this constant movement, small, low intensity, steady state movement through the day. And when we think about, we can get nerdy just for a moment, what that does to the body is it's always pushing up. So in the muscle cells, we can think about the legs because the legs are the ones that are going to be moving a lot when you're walking. In the leg muscles, you are going to be pushing insulin receptors up to the surface of the cell. So when we are walking or when we have that low level movement throughout the day, what's happening in the leg muscles is that we are pushing those insulin receptors up to the surface. So
Mm.
you're constantly clearing blood glucose, right? So we're taking the glucose up from the blood, and then the cell, in this case, the muscle cell, is able to use it so that we can, create energy. And so that's actually another thing that a lot of perimenopausal women will say is like, I just feel bagged all the time. Like I'm always tired. Well, one of the ways that you actually get over that lack of energy is more movement. I know that it's counterintuitive. We sort of think, well, I'm tired. I'll just go sit on the couch. But the more movement that you can, low level, you don't have to, like, we're not talking about Orange Theory, like, 7 hours a day. Certainly some high intensity interval training is if you're able to sort of work up to that, that's amazing. But to begin, I want to make sure that you are moving, you're getting a certain amount of steps a day, sunlight, and sleep. Like these are, for the most part, low cost to no cost barriers of entry for people getting healthy, and it works,
Yeah.
right? So those are what I tell people that are like, I'm on this diet and I'm making sure I'm cutting out this food group and I've done the keto and I've done the vegan and I've done the carnivore and I've done the orange 30 and I've done the F45. It's like all great.
Yeah.
And what time are you going to bed at night? How often are you on your phone? What is your exposure to natural sunlight in the poles of the day? So first part of the day that can set your circadian rhythm. If you have access to the sunset, that's also really great for starting the process of getting ready for sleep. And then what's your movement patterns like? Just manipulating those three levers. I know that it's going to sound crazy, but this is where you're going to have the biggest bang for the least, for the most part, the least amount of effort. The only thing it requires is the discipline to put the phone away. Like that can be the most difficult thing about it. Yeah.
Yeah. And even listening to you, like it was in 2020 where I started learning about like nutrition, like similar things that you're saying. And I was held accountable to implementing the discipline and the habit. And I
Mhm.
cannot tell you the mental resistance of the becoming, right? The becoming a different version of yourself. And now I'm thinking, how did I live a different way? Like I couldn't imagine that old version of myself. And you're looking, you're like, well, no wonder why you feel like crap. No wonder why things are not aligned. And so,
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
I keep hearing from you is you are required to become a different version of yourself. Like, you really are going through this big identity shift because
Yeah.
your habits are changing. Yes, maybe your body has kind of pushed you in that direction, but you do become a different version of yourself because it is required of you in order to thrive and feel good. And I'm using air quotes. So it's not just all what a test say, what does your doctor say? It's really taking ownership for your actions, for your behavior and how you want to feel.
Yeah. I talk about this in the context of weight loss. So a lot of women will come to me, the body comp changes, as we mentioned. I want to lose
Mhm.
weight, or I put on the perimenopausal 15, or, whatever it is. And you have to start thinking about what does the person who is 15 pounds, what does she do every day?
Yeah.
What is that persona? And let me make that my alter ego until it becomes my default. So does that person seek out nourishing foods? Does she uh, respond appropriately to her internal environment? Yes. Does she wake up and get sunshine? Yes. Does she prioritize movement over everything else?
Mhm.
Yes. What type of person loses 15 pounds and keeps it off? And then you have to use some of those behavioral traits and integrate them into your everyday life.
Yeah. And what does she do when she's not perfect, right? Like how does she get back in control or back
Mhm.
on it's yeah, it's an identity. It's a becoming. Like it's not a one and done. And that is where, for me, that's where freedom is knowing like things might not be aligned today or this week or something is off, but I have the skill and wisdom and knowledge to know where to seek it out. And then always coming back to self and going, how am I showing up to do this work? Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
I'll say one more thing. In the same way that I was talking about, does my medical provider have some cognitive flexibility? What is my cognitive flexibility? To your point about perfection, like I feel that in myself because I too am very much a recovering perfectionist. And there's going to be days you can do everything right. You can sleep all the time. You can get the good food. And you show up at the gym and it's a terrible session. And there's no explanation for it other than it was just a terrible session.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so do you have the cognitive flexibility to let it go? Or are you going to be a masochist
Mhm.
and beat yourself up about it for the remainder of the day, week, month,
Yeah.
whatever? Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds like a huge energy leak for me. Just beating yourself up with no
Yeah.
valuable, like no that all that energy that you lost was not life enhancing. The last thing I want to say too is I feel like you are a practitioner that or a physician that practices what you preach, right? Like there's nothing more to me. This is maybe it's the type of person I am, but I seek out healthcare providers who are leading in alignment with their values. And I'm curious your thoughts on that because sometimes I walk into, could even just be like a functional clinic, and I'm like, I have no respect for the advice that you're giving me because clearly you are not living you are not practicing what you preach. So I'm curious your stance on
Yeah.
that.
This is a really interesting question. I've been asked this before, in different versions. Like I've been asked more bluntly, or maybe slightly differently than the way you're asking it. Like, would you ever trust an overweight healthcare provider?
Mm,
Or would you ever, I mean, that's sort of the questions that some of the things that I've been asked. And I've thought about this quite a bit, and I would say that as long as to the best of my evaluation, that this individual is so let's say that let's assume for a moment that my healthcare provider is obese. Um, as long as I can see that they are doing their best with the tools that they have at the time that they have to make changes for themselves, I'm okay surrendering to their advice and listening to their expertise. Because there's a lot of reasons that make for in this particular example, like thyroid medications. There's corticosteroids. There's many medications that actually birth control pill that contribute to a change in body composition for people. So I think that it can be initially, and certainly we're all humans, and this is what we do. This is what our brain does. We categorize people, right? So I think that it's the categorization. I don't want to dismiss it entirely.
hmm
I think that there's some value there. And I would pair that with, do I see this person making a concerted effort to improve their health? One of my friends, he's a life coach in the States, and he had a terrible, he was dragged through a dam, broke his back. He's had, and so of course, because of that, he was sedentary for many years, put on an excessive amount of weight, and of course, that weight exacerbated the back pain. But he's a brilliant guy, right?
hmm
And he was kind of a life coach and everything. And I remember someone, I can't remember where, how the conversation came up, but someone had challenged him, like, why should I listen to you? You can't even like control what goes into your body. And it's like, well,
mm
he's on a slew of pain medications. He's immobile for, because he has this searing back pain. He broke his back, almost died being pulled through this dam and was skinned alive. It's like a terrible story.
hmm
And he's now like he went on, not that I'm recommending this, but went on the carnivore diet. That seemed to really work well for him, lost a ton of weight. And then from that was able to be a bit more ambulatory, a bit more mobile. So for me, I would totally hire David in a second because his brain, he's a genius.
Yeah.
And he was making, at least as far as I could, comment or I could observe, he was lining up all the things at least to try. He was like trying carnivore, tried keto, tried the thing, found carnivore, stuck with it, lost a ton of weight, and then was able to start walking and doing more rehab on his back. And he had some shoulder issues
hmm
as well. So that's how I would kind of answer that is like, I'm going to observe that right now they're probably not where they are, maybe.
hmm
And is there a piece of that I don't know? Is there surgery or an accident or a medication that I may not be privy to, that information?
Yeah.
And even if that's not important, do I see them taking action in their own life?
Yeah. Are they leading, right? Like, are
Yeah.
they leading not in alignment with how they want to feel? It's not perfect all the time. Sometimes we're in seasons where, yeah, that a crisis has happened.
Yeah.
And what we see on the outside is not always what's happening behind the scenes.
Yeah.
And I do see a lot of people that will say, you need to manage your stress. And they're burnt out, like they are
Yes.
burnt out.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
that to me, I think is like a huge red flag where I'm like,
Yeah.
great, then teach me how you manage your stress. And when they
Right.
have no response to that or no human life experience, it's like, well, I just read in a study that you need to manage your stress. There's
Yeah.
the practicality of like, show me what this looks like in the real world.
Yes.
Because you can
Yes.
have way more respect for someone who it's like how they got back up or how they're leading every single day rather than this all or nothing. And like, data and science is beautiful, but what does that look
Well,
like
it's
in the
like that. Well,
practical
maybe you should just
world?
eat less and exercise more. It's like eat less of what? Exercise.
Right.
How do I move more? This advice that you hear all the time, and I'm sure that there's listeners who've heard this. Just eat less and exercise more. It's like eat less of what?
Yes.
Exercise. How do I exercise more? Like that is almost a useless statement because it's not specific in any way. There's no customization to the patient.
hmm
The patient already probably doesn't have a good understanding of how to move well and how to eat well for their body.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm like, we could talk about so many things. So I know people are going
Yeah.
to have many conversations. And I wanted to actually get into hormones with you in the sense of like, someone's, do I need additional hormones? I don't even know if we can talk about that within 5 minutes, or they should just
Well,
maybe
the
go
answer
find your
is maybe.
podcast.
Yeah,
Maybe.
the answer is maybe. Yeah, if you are above the age of 35, I'll say my best recommendation is that as much you should be able to get, whether you are in the States, Canada, most of Europe, you should be taking a standard blood panel with like lipids, sex hormones every 6 months or so.
Okay.
Um, so that you can have at least some kind of baseline of what normal is for you right now. So if there are any abrupt changes like there is in menopause, you'll be able to pick them up. Like you'll be able to pick them up clinically, but you can
Mhm.
also see them on the lab, right? So that's the first thing. And then my answer is maybe. I think that the conversation around hormones has been shut down for like 23 years, unfortunately, because of that study that I mentioned, the Women's Health Initiative. In my opinion, one of the biggest disservices to women ever done, because it pulled so many women off of hormone therapy because of this, stated risk of breast cancer and cardiovascular events. I did a whole debunking of the study. So if you want to listen to for those nerds that are listening that want all the details, I'm the chief nerd, card carrying nerd as well. So if you want more of the details on why the study was a disservice to women, you can look it up on my podcast. But I think that, I think women at least deserve the opportunity to have the conversation about hormones with their primary care provider. You always have to look at history, right? So histories of breast cancer, and even that's being refuted. Women who are past menopause, who are 60, 65, who are told you shouldn't have hormones, you can't have hormones, and they're sort of past that 10-year window.
Mhm.
Now we're sort of revisiting that and saying, okay, if these women are still suffering, maybe there is a time and place for them to be on some kind of estrogen or progesterone combination. It kind of depends on whether or not you have a uterus and all of that. But I think that the answer is maybe. And for me, I'm very pro hormone therapy, like hormone replacement therapy. So I'll state my bias. If you are eligible for hormones, and it makes so clinical, we see clinical signs, and then we can also, if we are looking at labs and looking at optimized ranges, we can see changes there. And then you pair that with the clinician. I think that there's absolutely a case to be made for hormones in terms of their cardioprotective effect. So
Mhm.
particularly estrogen, we see cardiovascular risk drop for women who are on hormone replacement therapy. So that's sort of opposite to what that study initially had found.
Mhm.
Um, it of course improves quality of life. I mean, the night sweats, the hot flashes, the inability to sleep, all of these different things. You can argue that the lack of like sleep is like a panacea. It is, if we could bottle sleep, the benefits that it gives, I don't think we'll ever have anything comparable to sleep or exercise. Like you'll never be able to bottle those two things, right?
Yeah.
But if you're able to improve someone's sleeping by giving them hormones because they are now in a hormone deficient state, by definition, that's what menopause is, right? Our hormones plummet to 1% of what they were. And I don't think a lot of women listening sort of realize what a big change that is. That's going from, 0 to 300. Like you fall off a cliff. Like
Yeah.
your hormones fall off a cliff, and you might have more of a intimate relationship with what that feels like, given your chemotherapy and sort of the chemically induced menopause. You know what that feels like. For some, it feels awful,
Yeah.
for many women. And certainly you can speak to your experience here as well. But I think that if you are not feeling like the way you were and you have suspicions, um, you are your own greatest advocate. And I think I don't want you to go into your doctor and be like, Dr. Stephanie told me that if you don't give me like that's not the attitude we want to go in. Like they are just humans at the end of the day. We want to have productive, strategic, respectful conversations with our healthcare providers. They are here to help us. But I definitely think that it should be part of a conversation for women. We should at least have the option to talk
Yeah.
about it. Yeah.
Every time I have conversations about health, like from an educational perspective, it's always about me learning something new and then learning the skill of how can I respectfully communicate this with someone that might be triggered that I'm introducing new information into a conversation, and not giving up until you feel seen and heard and that something is shifting in your body. Because I just over and over again I hear empowerment, like self advocacy, and just not giving up hope until you're like, finally something is aligning. And it might not be one person, right? It might be like, let's try this, now let's try this, now let's do this.
Yeah.
And life is a journey and health is a journey, and your body is constantly changing and growing, and life is happening around you, and things will go up and down. And I think even just looking at myself compared to like my mother's generation, my grandmother, is that, you know, especially in Canada, when you're like, oh, why are you doing that? Well, my doctor told me to, right? And
Right.
now
Well, they
we
have the
have this
cultural authority,
information.
right? We don't question the
Yes.
doctor. Yeah,
Yes. And
totally.
now it's not even, yeah, we can question, but we also have thoughts and feelings and desires and
Hmm.
perspective, and you are allowed to voice them. It's a
Well
co-creation,
said.
it's a relationship.
Absolutely. And with any relationship, there's dialogue.
Yes. All right, Dr. Stephanie, I guarantee you they're like, I want more of her. So where can they find you? And especially for the ones that like to geek out on all the things that you share, your podcast, your newsletter, what are you up to? Where can they connect?
Yeah, I, like you, am a fellow podcaster. So the podcast is called Better with Dr. Stephanie. So wherever you're listening to this, you'll find Better with Dr. Stephanie. And we have thought leaders. I speak to scientists. I do solo episodes, like I mentioned, the debunking of the World of Women's Health Initiative. So that's probably one of the best ways that you can nerd out if you're a, card carrying member of the Nerd Army Unite. So there's that. And then I also write a newsletter every week. It's called the Mini Pause. And that's my little play on menopause. And it's basically a weekly roundup of science and action items for women who are 40 plus. And we actually structure the newsletter for people who want zero detail. It's all like the summaries at the top, and who
Mhm.
people who want a little bit more detail, that's like the next paragraph. And then the nerds, like you can read all the way through. So we get into the
I love
science,
it.
we get into the mechanisms, all stuff. So if you just want like, just tell me what to do, doc, it's right at the top. We
Mhm.
call it TLDR, too long didn't read. Here's the summary. Here's what you do. And then, the longer that you read the newsletter, the more detailed it is. So you sort of choose your own adventure. Some weeks you're going to be like, yeah, I want to know more about this. Some weeks you're like, just tell me the action items. And then, so that's at drstephaniestima.com/newsletter. And we send that out every Saturday.
I love that. I would be the one. So I'm the type of person that I surround myself with all these like wicked smart people who nerd out and they're the geeks and like tell me what to do. And then I
Yeah.
just trust you and I
Yeah.
do the thing. And then I'm like, okay, how did that feel? Good, bad, not so good. Keep going.
Yeah. Awesome. I
Love it.
love that.
Fast, 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 fast. All right. Dr. Stephanie, thank you for being here. This was value packed, and I am so excited for the ladies to dive over or jump over to your podcast to dig in and learn more about you, because you're a wealth of knowledge. And I just wanted to say thank you for dedicating your life's work to helping women thrive.
Thank you.